Hey guys, it's Liam here again on my channel, Goth Scouser. The reasons for that are obvious. But moving on, this video I'm really excited to make because I'm finally going to talk about my favourite ever video game console of all time to date. That was released in 1985, the Nintendo NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System. A follow-up to Japan's first attempt at it called the Famicom, the family computer as it's known. That is something separate though, so I will cover that at a different time. But for now, I just want to go and tell you about the Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, many people who like their video games and know of the NES will know that the Nintendo Entertainment System is known as the system that rescued the video game market after the video game crash. The reason for that, I'm not going to go into too great a detail, not right now at least, but the reason for that is because back in the 80s, in the early to mid 80s, the video game crash happened because there was just so many different types of video game consoles available. It wasn't like today where you've just got the Nintendo Wii U, the PlayStation 3, the Xbox. I know the PlayStation 4 is due imminently, as is the Microsoft Xbox One. I know they are due imminently, but they're not out yet at the time of making this video. So really, at the moment, there's only those three to go by. Nintendo, Microsoft, Sony. That's all you've got now, which is good, because you don't want too many anyway. But back in the day, in the 80s, there were so many fucking consoles out there that you just didn't know which ones were shit, which ones were good. You didn't know which games were crap, which ones were brilliant. It wasn't like today where you could just go online, read some reviews of the games, see screenshots of the games, see full video of the game so you know what you're buying. Back then you didn't know that, you just had to buy it and hope for the best, and most of them turned out to be piles of shit. And that was why people lost faith in video games altogether and just stopped buying them, and stores stopped selling them. But Nintendo were quite crafty. They introduced the Nintendo NES mainly with an accessory, which I will cover in another video called Rob, which was a little robot that basically came with your NES. And it was marketed as something other than a video game console. But again, that's just going off subject. For now, I'm just going to talk about the NES itself, show you what it looks like, tell you a little bit more about it. And for those who don't know, the NES didn't just come in its classic square box model, which most people will know. The square box model was the most iconic. It did also come mainly in North America, I believe. If I am wrong, and if it was released in different countries, officially released in different countries, the NES Top Loader. Now, if that was released officially in different countries, then by all means do let me know, because as far as I'm aware, it was only released in North America. And if you're thinking to yourself, what's the NES Top Loader? You'll see very shortly. It's just a redesigned model of the NES. I suppose you could say it's a bit like the Sega Master System, the Master System 2, and the Mega Drive, and the Mega Drive Model 2. When I say Mega Drive, by the way, for those obviously listening from or watching from North America, I refer to the Mega Drive, which is the Genesis, the Sega Genesis. But again, I don't want to go into too much detail because that's a history lesson. I want to show you the console itself, show you what it is, and tell you just why it was brilliant. One of the best 8-bit systems, in fact, no, fuck that. The best 8-bit system ever made. So here we go. Okay guys, there it is. The Nintendo NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System. As you can see there, very, very basic design. Just a square box. And on your front, your power button, your reset button, and left of the power button there, it would light up to indicate that it was switched on. To the right of that, inputs for your controllers, input 1, input 2. So just two input controllers there, which was standard really with any video game console. Turning it round, you've got your AV input, audio video there. That was the best way to connect it at the time. But you did have the alternative RF input there if you wanted to connect it that way, but that meant you had to actually tune the picture in, and most people preferred not to do that. It was best to use the RF. And obviously to the left of that you've got your AC adapter, so where you literally plug it into to be able to plug it into the wall. Now on the front, this is where you'll put your game. game would go in, push it down and turn it on. So let's show you that now. Here is a classic NES game. I mean classic as in the shape of it, of course. There are some other games over there which I'll show in a moment. This is Friday the 13th. Absolutely crap game, but basic design, as you can see. All you did with this, put it in like that, push it in, push it down, turn it on. There we go. Always keep the dust cover closed, of course. You don't want dust getting in there. Dust gets in there, you're going to get a flickery screen or the game may not connect properly. Now, putting a game in sideways was not the best way for connectivity anyway, because it meant that it was literally in against gravity, and obviously gravity is going to make it go down, which eventually did bend the pin connectors. So those with an NES like this will have eventually had to have changed the pin connectors in. When it comes to a console that's got cartridge based, the best way really was to have it top loading so the game went in, so it was permanently pushing down in that way rather than being bent if it's slided in. Now this one, as you can see on the front, says Nintendo Entertainment System Mattel version. Now there is a reason why it says Mattel version, because when Nintendo originally released the NES on its European release, they decided to give the distribution rights to Mattel. They distributed it themselves in North America, which is why North American NES is just say Nintendo Entertainment System, and they don't have anything there. They don't say Mattel version, they don't say any other version, it just says Nintendo Entertainment System, nothing else is there. Now, after a little while though, Nintendo decided that they probably made a mistake giving distribution rights of the Nintendo Entertainment System to Mattel. So they took those rights away from Mattel and they released it again themselves. Rather than using Mattel, they used themselves this time. And this one was exactly the same in appearance, the same grey box that you can see here. But they decided to release it under their own name, which is why this model was shortly released. So let's move this one out of the way. Here we are. As you can see, exactly the same, except underneath it says NES version. Now, to be clear, there are absolutely no differences at all between the Mattel version and the NES version. If you happen to have a Mattel version, it just means that you've got one of the earlier models, and the NES is just a slightly later model. Apart from that, absolutely no difference at all. So it's still the same AV input, exactly the same at the back, no difference whatsoever. So you're not missing out if you've only got the NES version or you've only got the Mattel version. No difference at all. And that's that. Okay guys, now I'm going to try and make this quick because I don't really want this video to concentrate on the NES games themselves. That is something that I am going to do in another video and show you my collection, which is close enough to almost every NES game ever released, but there are still a few that I am missing, and those who are collectors of NES games will know that it's very expensive to have almost every game. Some do cost thousands just for one game. So I'm going to keep this brief and just show you a couple of the different types of NES game variations that were available back in the day. Now on your far left here, you've got the classic grey cart with, as you can see at the bottom right of the sticker, that little circle. You probably can't read it, but it basically says Nintendo's official seal of approval. Means they authorise this game to be made. And that's how 99 or 95%, take your pick, but most NES games looked exactly like this. It's classic grey cart. Occasionally, Nintendo released games like this, the gold cart, mainly for the Zelda games. There was Zelda 1, The Legend of Zelda, and Zelda 2, The Adventures of Link. These were released. They're still official, as you can see, they are still official releases, but they were in the gold cart. But apart from the colour, they are still exactly the same in terms of appearance. You've still got the same grip in there, that little dip there for you to put the game in, push it down, exactly the same connectors, etc. So they're your official titles. Some more obscure gems though, however, were these. Most unofficial NES games were released in black carts like this. Some were in blue, some were in white, some were even in grey, silver, but majority of the unofficial titles were released in black carts like this. They're not the same in appearance. You've got no labels at the top, which all NES games did, which makes it easier to find them when you've got them stacked on top of each other. But they didn't come with any of that. This is how most of the unofficial NES games looked. Now, it's not like today though, where you can't go into, say, a store where you buy a video game and just, you know, buy an unofficial game. The only ones you could buy in the stores these days will just be the official release titles. You might be able to get some sort of pirated games or homebrewed games elsewhere, but they're through unofficial channels. Back in the day though, in the 80s, you could officially buy in stores these unofficial titles. There was not too much things in the way preventing this. Nintendo weren't too happy about it, but they weren't really able to stop it at the time, so these were still fully available to buy in stores. There was, you know, there was adverts or commercials on TV advertising these unofficial games. This one here, Exodus, is some sort of Bible game. It's absolutely bollocks. It looks a bit like Crystal Mines, which is an NES game, which is a very good NES game. Well, I thought it was. But again, not going to go too much into the NES games in this video. This was also an unofficial title. One of the most unusual and potentially expensive unofficial titles ever released as well. This one's called Action 52. I am going to go into this one in great detail in another video. As you can see, it's literally colourless. You can see the circuit board in there. This one's got 52 games on it. Most NES circuit boards are not this big. They only come up to about here, usually, so this is an unusually large circuit board. Most of this stuff here, you could chop all of this off at the top from about here upwards and the game would still work fine. So they're your unofficial titles, or, well, a couple of them. There were quite a lot. Now, they did come in, you know, your boxes like these, just normal cardboard boxes. Some of them I've still got in decent condition. You know, your cardboard box, NES Open, Dragon's Lair, a couple that I've got in really good condition. Now this is a normal NES box, but it's an unofficial title. Another Codemasters game. We made a lot of the black carts in a bit of a crappy condition, but most games just came in the boxes like these. Most people don't have the boxes these days, but the majority of the people who still have NES games will at least have these. These are the dust sleeves. All you did with the dust sleeve is you just stood your game in there and it just stopped the connector on there from getting dust in there, so you just slid it into the cover and it just stopped you getting some dust on there, that's all. That's my Action 52 instruction manual. And that's it, that's just, you know, your official release games, your unofficial release games, and some boxes. I am looking forward to showing you my NES game collection because there's an awful lot. But that's not for this video, so we'll move on. Okay guys, now I don't want to touch too much on accessories and controllers because that is something for another time, but it is important to show some of the controllers and things that you could get with the NES at the time. Now to start with, if we go to the left here, this is the first official NES controller that was released. Most people that had an NES will know this controller because if you got an NES, you got this controller with it. Your normal controller, see, with your start, select, jump button, run button, or whatever game you may be playing, but it was usually jump for the A button anyway, and your standard up, down, left, right controller. They all had the same input, of course, which was this, just to go into your NES. Now I did show the gun that came with the Master System, so if I move up here, this is the Nintendo light gun, or the Zapper. Now this is one of the second models though, because the first Zapper that came with the NES, it was still grey here, but it was also grey here and here, so the orange was a later release. The reason it was released in orange rather than grey as a later release was because It was thought by, I don't know, governments, police, councils, whatever, that the grey version looked a little bit too much like a gun, so they wanted to make it look more like a toy. You know, God knows how you confuse this with a real gun, but who knows. But yes, it was released as an orange model a bit later on, just to make it look more like a toy and less like a gun. The grey model is still just as common as the orange model though, so this is just the first one I grabbed. Over here, some games did allow you to have 4 players, and that's exactly what this is for. There's not much introduction needed on this. It just comes with a 2 input there, just so you can plug that in, then you can plug your 4 controllers in. If you ever want to, I don't know, have a game of wrestling, or I don't know, any type of game that came with 4 players really. But yeah, at least you had the option of doing that. Obviously the Nintendo 64 years later came with 4 controller inputs as standard anyway. But the majority of consoles, including the PlayStation, Xbox, etc., you'd still need some form of extension like this if you want to play more than one joypad, well, more than 2 joypads I should say. Now this is the NES Max. The thing that's important about this one is it still gave you exactly the same controls as this one, except for one important difference: these turbo buttons. Now basically what a turbo button does, or did I should say, for those who don't know, is if you were playing a game that required you to constantly press the button to fire, you know, each press is a single fire, having the turbo button allowed you to hold the button down and it would just continuously fire. So you didn't have to wear your finger out pressing the fucking thing like that. You could just hold it down. There was a joystick also released that looked a bit like an arcade joystick. That also had turbo buttons on it as well, called the NES Advantage. Although mine's in a loft and I just cannot be cannot be bothered getting that out at the moment. That's something that's going to be in the accessories video. And that's it. That's just a couple of your controllers, your light gun, and your 4 people play. Told you it was going to be brief, because next I want to show you what came after the NES, but still in the NES lifespan. So here we go. Okay guys, now just before I do move on to the next form the NES took, I just want to explain the reason why they did release the next form of the NES. Well, one of the reasons why. Because even though the NES was fantastic and it's the best console ever made, it did have one major design flaw, which was the fact that it was a side loader for the games. When you had to put them in sideways, it did over time bend the pin connectors that connected the game to the system, stopping it from working. And most NES systems these days, you'll most likely find they've got new pin connectors put in there. They are fairly straightforward to replace the pin connector, which is really, really easy. But that's something, maybe I'll cover that in another video, but that's more of an instructional video, and I don't know if I can be arsed doing something like that. You'll find an easy video, obviously, on to change the pin connectors on YouTube anyway, so it's probably unnecessary to make a video like that. But that was the main flaw with it, the fact that it was side loading. Now in 1993, a couple of years after the Super Nintendo was released, the NES was still really popular in itself, so Nintendo decided to re-release the NES in what became known as the NES Top Loader, or the NES Model 101, and this is it. Now this is the NES Top Loader. Most people watching in this country, Great Britain, in Liverpool, England, wherever you want to say, this one will probably be unknown to you unless you've got one shipped over from America. But this was released in 1993 for a third of the cost of the original NES. Does exactly the same thing despite it being a lot smaller, a lot thinner, but it did exactly the same thing. There's your 2 controller inputs, and there's your power, your reset button. Or you didn't press it down, pressed it up. Now, the difficult thing about the NES Top Loader over here in Great Britain and probably the rest of the world outside of North America, it didn't come with an AV input. It was just purely RF input. Now you may think by looking at this one that I'm lying, because as you can see, yes, it does have an AV input in there. But they didn't come as standard that way. They came with RF only, which meant lesser picture quality because you have to tune the picture in and it just wasn't as good. And if you've got a standard top loading NES, it's not going to work on a TV over here in Great Britain unless you get it modded or modified, as I've had this one done. This one's been modded with an AV input so that it will work over here in a British television, because without that AV input it just wouldn't work. But you'll find that most of them will look very similar to this at the back, but you've got your REF there, you've got your power, but this one's been modded out so that it actually has an AV output as well, so it works fantastic over here. Exactly the same controllers, not much else to say about that. It was, it was a third of the price, and the games will work first time guaranteed on this. One other thing though about this that made it unique is that there were regional differences in terms of the games. So even though an NES game released in North America on the Nintendo Entertainment System looks exactly the same as one released in, say, Europe, the games may have looked exactly the same, but a North American game would not work on a British NES like this unless you remove the lockout chip. Again, if you want to know how to remove a lockout chip, the chip, by the way, is in the NES, not in the game. You don't go asking about with the game. You remove what's known as the lockout chip in the NES if you want American NES games to work on a British system. But if you have this, you don't need to remove any lockout chip because this console was universal. This would play any NES game regardless whether it was European or American. It didn't matter. This thing just fucking played anything. Whereas with this one, you couldn't play American games on it unless you remove the lockout chip. And the American equivalent, you couldn't play a European game on it again unless you remove the lockout chip. So this one's fantastic, not only for the games loading first time more often because it's a top loader, but it will pretty much play anything. And very, very lastly, moving on to more of the modern age, this is just one example of an NES clone. Flattery, obviously, is one of the imitation, I should say, sorry, is one of the best forms of flattery. And this is an imitation of the NES. There's many of them out there. This one's just called the Retro Bit. It's extremely small, it's very fucking light, and it's a top loader. And it will play your NES games, regardless of the region. You've got your power button there, your reset button there, controller inputs, even came with its own controllers. Now the good thing about these clone systems, especially these Retro Bit ones, is that you could put your original NES controllers in there. For some reason though, there must have been some slight difference that you can't really tell by the eye, because these clone controllers will not work in a real NES, but the real controllers will work in the clone system. And if you can't find one of these and you don't want to or don't know how to remove the lockout chip from one of these, maybe look for a clone console. I mean, I can't say I would recommend it though, because you're not going to get the same experience if you play it on a clone console than you would do if you play it on the real thing. So really, get the real thing, try and find one of these, or just look on YouTube and find an instructional video to remove the lockout chip on one of these and get your American games over there. Because there were a lot more games released in North America than over here in Great Britain. And that's it. Imitation is definitely a sincere form of flattery. Now, even back in the days of the NES, though, when it was in its heyday, there were still loads of these clone systems out there because the NES, Nintendo didn't release these things worldwide. You couldn't get an NES in countries like, one example, Russia. If you wanted to play NES, then you had to get a clone. Not necessarily this one, this is a bit more of a modern one, but there were still clones available in the 80s, and that was the only way you would play them on. You would play your NES games, if you didn't have the official system, which you probably couldn't get in certain countries back in the day, you had to buy a clone system. It was the only way. But I don't use these clones, they're just part of the collection. Always play the games on the official systems. You get the very, very best out of them if you do that. And that's it. That are the systems. Original, later model, clone. I hope you've enjoyed looking at these consoles. Any questions, by all means, do ask. Okay guys, that's it. That was the NES. The best ever video game console ever made to date, bar none. I will obviously cover the games themselves in future videos, but for now I still have a lot more consoles to go through. The Sega Saturn, the 3DO, the CDI, just to name a few. But that was it. I hope you enjoyed a look at the NES and some of the obscure unofficial titles that were released. You know, a different look at the games themselves. A lot more focus will be on the games though in some of the videos. So that's it. Hope you enjoyed it, guys. If you do, by all means, you know, leave us a comment, rate the video, support the show, and I'll see you very soon. Take care. Bye.